Good morning, everyone. So, we don't physically gather for our worship this morning, but we gather in spirit and in solidarity. This lockdown, of course, is due to end on Monday night, meaning that our church activities during the week and our worship next Sunday should, hopefully, be back on in the physical, social sense here in the building next week. But with a case of community transmission coming to light in the community yesterday, anything is possible. So this lockdown may be extended. We don't know. Let's hope and pray that we can meet again very soon. So, the sermon I prepared. On Friday afternoon, when this 3-day lockdown was announced, my dear mate Darren was particularly disappointed, as I suppose of many people, especially those who'd planned to have a long weekend over this Anzac Day long weekend down south. He and his wife Sarah had made special plans for a romantic dinner in a classy restaurant in celebration of their wedding anniversary. They hadn't been out for a dinner together as a couple for 2 years, and now those plans were kaput. But for Darren, there was one bright side to this long weekend in lockdown, because as a faithful observer of the annual Anzac Day commemoration, he'd only need to now travel as far as his driveway for that ritual. My family growing up didn't make much of a fuss of Anzac Day. As a kid, my participation in Anzac Day commemorations came via school, public school at that, and as part of my involvement with Cubs, which later became Sea Scouts. And as a kid, Anzac Day, brought in by those outside of immediate family influence, began to hold a very special place for me. But then later in life, in my early 20s, a certain Prince of Peace, this figure of love for all, this source of a higher universal idea of the solidarity of all creation, appeared at the door of my life, my heart and my thinking, my behaviour, and the status of my relationship with Anzac Day, which I felt in contemporary times had become very much a misunderstanding of the commemoration of the suffering and service of war, and had moved into a kind of a celebration of nationalistic zeal. So my relationship with Anzac Day moved from harmonious to it's complicated. Growing up, my great uncle Bert was the only veteran of World War I that I was close to. Uncle Bert was a wonderful man. He was a softly spoken, wise, a gentle giant. And he was very young, at the minimum age, I think, when he followed his dad, my great-grandfather, into service for what they came to call the War to End All Wars. He was also a young man who regarded Jesus' teaching on peace and non-violence as explicit. As I remember the stories that my family told of Uncle Bert, I didn't hear these words from him. But young Private Strawn was initially selected to be trained as a Lewis machine gunner on account of his size, strength, and excellent eyesight. But young Bert declined the role, saying he didn't sign up to kill anybody. And and I can only imagine how that was received by his superiors in army training. "Fine then," said the Australian Imperial Force, "we'll put those broad shoulders of yours to work instead as a stretcher bearer." Uncle Bert then worked and lived through some of the bloodiest campaigns of that war, ducking in and out of no man's land, carrying the broken, the maimed, the screaming, and of course those who it was far too late to save. He didn't talk much about those memories at all, but I know the nightmares stayed with him for life. They called it shell shock after the First World War, because back then no one spoke about trauma. Uncle Bert held his convictions through that war about doing no injury to others, and then spent the war walking through the very worst of hell, not doing it. At first glance, one might say today's gospel reading from John about the Good Shepherd and the Good Shepherd laying down his life for the sheep fits well the idea of dying in service of others that we talk about around Anzac Day. In a conversation here before a board meeting on Thursday, our own Clive, of course a military veteran, and he continues as a leader in the Airmen's Association, Clive questioned the interpretation of this passage, the Good Shepherd laying down his life for the sheep. He questioned whether that was actually about dying. Looking at the original Greek, I think he might just have a case. To be fair, looking at the larger overall text of John's Gospel, we might well argue for reading the Greek, and I apologize here massively for my pronunciation. We might well argue for reading ten psychen or to tydeson, traditionally rendered into English as the life of him lays down, as meaning something about dying, literally physically dying. We should also acknowledge that translating psychen into English as life and tydeson into English as lays down are somewhat subjective choices of interpretation, at least subject to questioning and consideration. The base meaning of the Greek word psychen, from which we get the English psyche, was spirit/breath. Not spirit or breath, spirit and breath. Remember, spirit and breath were not separate ideas in ancient Greek or ancient Hebrew thinking. It was much later that Western humanity decided that breath, on the one hand, was a physiological phenomenon, and spirit was a metaphysical concept over here. And so, in understanding that breath and spirit are one and the same for ancient people, does the Good Shepherd lay down his breath? Perhaps. Does he lay down his spirit? I'm not so sure. A curiosity should pique here, though, with the word tydeson, the verb tydeson. This is a verb used in the sense of to place, to position, to establish, to fix, as in to fix your attention upon someone, to establish a bond with someone, or position yourself in relation to someone or something. This starts to sound more like a shepherd than a martyr, doesn't it? The Good Shepherd fixes his full being on the sheep. The hired hand flees from trouble, as Jesus tells. But this shepherd, the Good Shepherd, is living for those in his care. His life is fixed upon them and his care for them. During that First World War that our history books often calls great, Uncle Bert fixed his life on the wounded and the dying, as did so many nurses, doctors, and medics. Mothers and children fixed their lives on hoping their husbands and fathers would come home. Airmen, sailors, and soldiers gave their breath and spirit to the safety of their crews and units in the direst of human experiences. A generation walked through a hell of human making, as too many have before, too many have since, and too many continue to do so today. When previous generations needed to believe that God was on their side in a massive armed conflict, they sang hymns like Onward Christian Soldiers and The Son of God Goes Off to War. Maybe some sang such songs as a prayer for God to aid in the destruction of foes. I don't know. I imagine, though, for many, these were songs of desperate hope for good shepherding. Keep us safe. Keep them safe. Grant us your spirit to keep each other safe. Bring peace. Please bring peace. I don't think it's enough for us today to offer thoughts and prayers for peace and an end to violence. I believe it's our calling as followers of the way to do just like the Good Shepherd does. To fix our living, our breath, our spirit on the safety and the good of all humanity, the care of all humanity, to fix our lives, our breath, our spirit on the way of the Prince of Peace. The Spirit of peace is our breath, is our good air. Breathe it in, breathe it out. Amen. My sisters and brothers, until we can meet again, abide during this time of quiet in the contagious love and goodness of our Christ. Know the blessing of God, our beginning, our revelation, and our breath is upon you today and always. Amen. Peace be with you. See you soon.